Order, order. Welcome to the Government's new approach to addressing the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland evidence session. And thank you to our witnesses for coming along today. Alan, Sandra and Kenny, can you say who you are and the organisation you represent? Alan.
Alan Brecknell, and I'm an advocacy support worker with the Finucane Centre.
I'm Sandra Peake, CEO of Wave Trauma Centre.
I'm Kenny Donaldson, Director of South East Fermanagh Foundation.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm going to start the questions. What's your view of the government's approach to legacy thus far, Alan?
It's quite a loaded question.
Yeah.
I think since the new Labour government has taken power, we have seen a change in approach to how things are being done. There is definitely more level of engagement than there maybe was with the previous government. I still think that there are huge issues with the Legacy Act and things that have been suggested that can be fixed and whatever. But from our point of view, and I suppose the families that we work along with, there's still a long way to go in relation to dealing with legacy. And again, I suppose from our point of view, we would say that while it's encouraging to see some of the changes that are being proposed, there's always seems to be a time delay in all of these things, and we need to bear in mind the age profile of most of the people who we're dealing with. I lost my father in 1975 during the period of the Troubles, the conflict. My mother is 92, so that's the age profile of some of the people that we're dealing with here. Thankfully, she is still in good health and knows what's going on and asks me on a daily basis about my work and what I'm doing and whatever. But I think we need to start to think about how do we speed things up. We can't continually do things at this slow pace. And there are obviously ways of well, I would feel that things can be done more quickly. You know, we hear the Secretary of State talking about we need primary legislation and we can only get that through Parliament whenever we can find a time slot and all of this. And to people who this affects on a day-and-daily basis, that's, excuse my language, is gobbledygook. They just think, why can this not be sorted out?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Sandra?
I mean, I think that the process to date is welcome, but deeply frustrating. The last government, when they departed in 2010 or 2020 from Stormont House Agreement and from those sort of for the process that were suggested, I think that period in between has been very damaging for victims and survivors. We have seen a lot of people coming back into service provision or indeed coming for the first time. And you know, I look at the proportion of people coming through. You know, 35% of the referral caseload is from the 1970s. So we can't underestimate how damaging the damaging process that's been done to date, and why so many people are looking now at this as a new horizon, and why it needs to be right. And as Alan said, you know, we have a process where people are getting older. But it doesn't diminish their want and their right to have the rightful thing done and to have a rightful process in place, and that's so important. You know, every day we see people coming through services, and fundamentally they need to know that their loved one mattered, what happened to them mattered, and that there is a process that will meet, you know, their needs. And I think that's why really that we now need to see sizeable change coming, and it needs to be sizeable change, and the Legacy Act should be looked at in its entirety rather than just sections picked out in terms of we look at this section, we look at that. It needs to be considered in the wholest way, because really people deserve they deserve a process to meet their needs, but they deserve for that to happen now, and for us not to be looking at that in 5 or 10 years' time. I think that's something which is fundamentally very important.
Sandra, Kenny?
Yes, well, like the other two speakers, I do have to remark that access in terms of the Secretary of State and in terms of NIO officials perhaps has improved somewhat over recent months. But I think whenever it comes down to it, we have to realise the three core issues that are preventing a universal agreement around legacy. And those issues are national security, non-criminal misconduct, and differences in opinion around that particular issue and how it should be addressed, and also the Irish state not being at the table. Those are the three issues which have got to be weaved through if there's going to be a resolution which is going to have maximum support across the sector. It would be a wrong thing to suggest that Stormont House being brought back onto this table tomorrow would be the answer, because it wasn't. There's a reason why it didn't reach the point of being enacted, and people need to be very clear diagnosing the problem if they're going to find the right solution. So from our perspective, we also say that it's critical at this point in time that a resolution is made on legacy, because it infects the present, and the levels of glorification of violence which exist within our society are absolutely systemic, and it's allowing would-be terrorists of today and of the future, it's sending a very, very dangerous message to them. So this once and for all has got to be resolved, and we do want to see a more robust UK government stance around the issue of the Irish. It cannot purely be marginalised as one state. There are two states who need to be brought to the table on this.
Evan Robinson.
Thanks very much. Good morning. Folks, Kenny, I'll start with you just on the basis of what you've said. That engagement has increased certainly in the last number of weeks and months. The Secretary of State indicated on the 4th of December that he was going to engage in a programme of consultation. Would you suggest that the engagement you have had is consultation? Are you being asked regularly, routinely or at all about individual proposals that the government want to bring forward for their plans on legacy? And then more particularly, given that you've raised three issues around national security, non-criminal misconduct and the role of the Irish government, which always seems absent from these discussions, are you being asked about those as part of the government's consultation?
It's a very good question. I think it's not exactly an even playing field of a conversation, if I can put it like that. You are being reported to in terms of this is a direction of travel that is being considered and what are your thoughts around this. But often our core issues are not factored. And I still go back to the point, this is not going to be resolved unless there's absolute correct understanding of what the problem is. And there isn't. It doesn't seem to be there. People need to understand that there's give right across the board needed to get this over the line. There's a reason in 11 years why legacy hasn't been resolved from Stormont House from 2014. And people need to, I think, lose some arrogance, to be straight with you, being tied to a particular set of proposals, and show a little bit of humility around, well, actually, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board on this. And how can we ensure that there's maximum support for this? And surely that should be the objective. Not actually who has the bragging rights of whose set of measures were actually supported, but rather what can actually attain the best possible resolutions for victims and survivors.
Is it fair to characterise that response then as you're not being consulted on the government's proposals, you're just being asked perhaps more routinely what your view of the world is?
Certainly a little bit of that. I mean, I suppose the last engagement that we had with a civil servant, there was a little bit more meat on the bone. But critically for us and for our borderland constituency, it is the issue of the Irish state. And we're talking 16 to 17% of the murders and killings of the Troubles, which connect to that, obviously, frontier. And there is an absence of response, if I can put it like that, when you raise it with the NIO. It's more or less said that we're having some discussions and they're not at a particularly advanced level and there's a sounding out going on. But that's not good enough. And what I'm saying is you will not get people, victims and survivors, to buy into any new suite of proposals unless they can see the beginning, the middle and the end. Because too often people have been manipulated, they have been lied to, and they have got the raw end of the deal. This time round it needs to be locked down.
You again. How would you characterise the NIO's efforts at consultation over the last 4 months?
Well, I think it's greater. I think it's greater, and yet probably in terms of the fullest direction of travel, of how the government want to proceed, maybe isn't as clear. I mean, there's as Kenny said, there's greater maybe meat on the bones in terms of you're finding out some information in terms of changes that will be made. But I think that in amongst that, there's also been caveats around legislative frameworks and getting it back in, and the changes that can come. And we are concerned because there's issues around inquests, there are issues around civil cases, but really where most people will end up coming through is in the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Retrieval, and that's one of the most difficult issues. So yes, it's got better. Yes, it's been more engaging, but I think it needs to be fuller. It needs to be fuller still, and we need to see more sizable information in terms of the full direction and the changes that are going to be made. For many people, they were very hopeful when government came in because there was the concept of repeal and replace, and what changes that. So it was repeal and replace parts of it, but not all of it. And I go back to sort of my earlier point is in the Legacy Act, we need to look at this in its fullest sense, all of it, in its fullest sense, and not just aspects of it.
So more particularly then, can I ask you to reflect what your members or constituent families and victims would consider when they believed in repeal and replace, only to hear that there will be a consultation but that ICRIR is being retained? Did that jar with them?
It did, because many of them really had hoped that that a new process would come. And I think that I suppose that they became disillusioned in terms of what did that actually mean in practice. But I suppose, as Alan has said, people are getting older, and some people have, a small number of people have actually gone into the system, and the jury really is out in relation to the benefit of that, because we can see the fact that maybe even that has a number of issues that probably are not as good as we would want to see it for them. So yes, I think people they felt that something greater would come, and that's what they wanted to see. And we're an organisation where you could sit around a table like this, and there would be a very, there'd be different views in terms of what people would want to see happen, but fundamentally they want to see a process that works, and they want to see something which delivers fully for them.
Mr. Brecknell, I don't think we have met before, but you have engaged with the committee during a visit. How would you characterise consultation over the last number of months?
I suppose I would have to say, as well as Kenny and Sandra have already said, that it has progressed. It is on a different footing than let's say it had been in the past. But I still think that there are issues in relation to what it is we're being told or what it is being suggested is the way forward, because as both have already suggested, and you seem to be suggesting yourself, is it's more we're going to come and tell you what we think we should be doing with this act to make it a better act or to change it, as opposed to what do you think are the best things for repealing this act or changing this act or whatever. And I think, again, as Sandra has said, a lot of people that we would engage with were optimistic with the terminology of repeal and replace, because there were so many issues with the Legacy Act in relation to its genesis, where it come from, what it was meant to do, why it was put in place in the very first place, and how it was, in my opinion, steamrolled through the House of Commons during the last mandate. So I think while things are better, I'm not sure I would class what is currently happening as a consultation. That said, we are being asked, what do you think about this? So is that a consultation? I'm not so sure, to be honest. But I think I would definitely go back to the notion that if there is going to be some level of consultation, it needs to be done quickly. It needs to be focused. It needs to be sharp. It needs to be getting off the ground very, very quickly. And just to go back to one of the points that Kenny has mentioned in relation to the involvement of the Irish government, we would meet regularly with the Department of Foreign Affairs, and we would make the point every time we meet them that they need to be engaged in a more meaningful way as well. If we go back to the Stormont House Agreement, and I know there were issues and there were concerns about it, but I think it is a good starting place to put in place some sort of process that will work. As part of the Stormont House Agreement, there was the Historical Investigations Unit that was to sit in the north. We maintained and we said to every Irish official that we met that they needed to have a similar body in the south. Even from a practical point of view, if you have a body in the north that's going to ask questions of a body in the south, you need to have someone to answer those questions. So why not set it up at that time and have the same powers and have the same level of investigative powers? We thought that was the right thing to do under Stormont House. We think it's still the right thing to do.
We took evidence from CAJ. There was a report in February castigating the Irish government for never having created any legacy mechanism.
Yeah.
Whatsoever. Are those views you share?
And obviously, without a doubt. I mean, Justice for the Forgotten is part of the Pat Finucane Centre, and they were set up initially to campaign on behalf of the Dublin and Monaghan families. So they have issues that need to be addressed by the Irish state as well as by the British state. So I think if we're going to do this, we do it properly and we do it across the board.
Okay, thank you very much. Katrina Murray.
Thank you all for coming in today. I want to look at the subject of inquests. One of the things that kept coming through kept coming through in both the written evidence, the evidence presented orally to the committee, and picking up on the visits, is that inquests are exceptionally important to people, and rightly so. Can I start with you, Alan? From the written evidence from the centre, you say you were unclear why reinstating inquests can't be processed through the remedial order. Why is it not? Why is this the case? Or could you expand a bit more on that?
I'm not an expert on how Parliament works, but it was my understanding from the court judgments that they were deemed to be, or that section of the judgments found that it was unlawful, and therefore it was my understanding that inquests could be replaced under a remedial order. I think, however it's done, I think it needs to be done, and it needs to be done quickly. People will say that inquests were only working for a small number of people. That's correct, and no one disputes that fact. But to take something away from someone, especially you've promised people that you're going to go through this process, and that the Attorney General has decided that there is a case to answer here, there is something that needs to be looked at in more depth, and then for that to be pulled from under you with some arbitrary date of the 1st of May 2024, it's soul destroying for the individuals because they've fought long and hard to get their inquests. And I suppose the other point about it is we have seen how inquests have worked for some people. And I'm not suggesting that they will work for everyone, but they will work for some people, and they have worked for some people. And it has been about a certain amount has been about historical clarification. This has happened. This was the story that went out at the time. However, whenever we look at it 40 years later, there's a completely different story there. And we need to remember that was the important part of this. And I accept and I understand that not everyone can have an inquest, and not everyone will get to that phase. And that's why we need to have a process that can work for the vast majority of people. We are never going to get a process that works for everyone. And that's an unfortunate thing to say, but it is a reality. Someone will always want something more. There has to be something greater. There has to be something that, you know what I mean? It's just human nature, I suppose. So from that point of view, from our point of view, what we were saying, we couldn't see why a remedial order could not fix the inquest issue. And I still can't see why we now need to have primary legislation, which I suppose I'm saying the same thing just in a different way, to fix this process, because it was taken away very, very quickly. Why can it not just be replaced very, very quickly? There is also another issue around inquests where it seems to be now being suggested that no new inquests will ever be allowed until and after whatever is in place finishes its work. And you know, you're setting up a process now that is somewhat different to the rest of the United Kingdom. That was
kind of moving on to my next question, which was, which inquests would you want to see reinstated? Would it be the ones that basically were prematurely halted, or?
I honestly think if someone has been told that they're entitled to an inquest, they're entitled to an inquest. I don't think we start drawing new lines as to who's entitled and who's not entitled, and you know, we're getting into very shady ground there to say to someone, the Attorney General thinks you're entitled to an inquest, but sorry, this government doesn't.
Sandra, what's the views on the Wave constituent group about inquests?
I think fundamentally, I think that so many people were disillusioned when inquests were stopped. And if you have fought for so long and your loved one, you've never had an inquest into your loved one's death, surely it's the right thing that it should be done. And then to see that really pulled away from you. So the need for those inquests to resume, and to resume as soon as possible, is very clear. I think families have fought long and hard for them. And they should happen, and they should take place. But I also think that when families will often say, what is the difference in a murder that takes place here in the streets of London and a murder that takes place in the streets of Belfast? Why are we having why is there a different system that murder should mean murder? And families will really struggle with that. So in the same way, if you haven't had an inquest, surely it's a fundamental right to have that, and to have that allowed and facilitated, and that should take place.
Well, I suppose, look, as an organisation, our starting point has always been that every victim survivor has an entitlement to pursue justice, truth and accountability, and that should not be denied. But when we talk about, and this is the problem with our process, the piecemeal efforts that have been over the last number of years, you have to put yourself into the shoes of the victim and survivor who is not able to get any progression in their case whatsoever. And they then fall into this space of seeing others who have resources, whether it's financial or whether it's media, and the power of all of that focused in around the case. That's not denying those individuals' rights to pursue in that way, but it does have a very severe impact within the community of victims and survivors, and it does then present to them as a two-tier process. It also can be difficult from the perspective that I totally appreciate the issue of historical clarification, and there have been a number of cases where that has been deeply important for families to have loved ones cleared of involvement within terrorist groupings. That's important. But it's very, very difficult for innocent victims to watch sometimes resources lavished upon people who have been involved in terrorism, and who have those focuses upon them, and they look at that imbalance. That's critically what gets into them. So whatever we move forward with, you have to understand that for the vast majority of people impacted by terrorism, particularly within the constituency impacted by provisional IRA violence, they got a 2-hour box ticking exercise of an inquest 30 and 40 years ago. And what was the end outcome? Open verdict. Didn't work for them. They don't have an access point at this stage. So that is why it is absolutely critical that they do have a tangible progression route. And it's not enough to purely have a tokenistic form of justice on the table. It has to be a justice that is sought for, that is fought for, and that the state are 100% behind. That there's no sneaky beaky deals done as have been all over throughout time. This has got to be on the basis of transparency. And I suppose we categorise it as this. It's about all those who are involved in this no longer being begrudging participants, but being enablers for accountability. That's two states and it's terrorist organisations. If you can't answer that question, that they're going to make that transition, then you're not going to deliver for victims and survivors.
But can I pick up on one of those points? points, Kenny, because it's something that's kept coming back of actually the power of the inquest. But if having an inquest previously was not helpful and was seen to have been substandard, it has not had any of a beneficial effect on the families. Yeah, probably picking up some of certainly something that's been experienced across the board. It's just there. One of the things that the Secretary of State has talked about was that he would legislate to ensure that certain inquests, which involved sensitive information that were unable to be concluded in the coroner system, the inquest system, would be proceeded through ICRA. How do you feel about that proposal? I think I know, but it was certainly helpful to expand on that one.
I think if an inquest has been stopped for whatever reason, and in most instances it was because there were issues around onward disclosure of information to to the families and to the families' representatives, and a coroner has decided that information he cannot or she cannot either complete an inquest because the family would be put in a less favourable position. Well, we have to find another way around that, and we've made reference to it in our submission. We work very closely with the family of Sean Brown, and the coroner in that particular instance decided that the level of redactions that was being requested through PII were so severe and so extreme that he couldn't fulfil his duty as a coroner. So if in that particular instance, he was the person who suggested that there should be a public inquiry into the murder of Sean Brown. And therefore, it's up to the government now and the Secretary of State to bring that forward. To suggest to the Brown family, which the Secretary of State has done, that they should go to ICRA, even though they have been told, or he has been told face to face in a number of meetings with the family, that is not a process that they have any confidence in. Well, I'll leave it up to everyone else to decide how they want to describe that. But they have said that it is not a process for them. I think others have also said the same. I think if you're being asked to go to a body that is less than what you have been expecting, and that's the perception, that it is less than what you are expecting to be given, that's just a slap in the face to you, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that if an inquest is taking place, or indeed an inquest has been ordered but not delivered, and you're being given that as an alternative, it is viewed as insulting to the family, and it is viewed as really trying to further diminish what has happened to their loved one. I suppose we can't underestimate. I mean, you mentioned about inquests, and for many families, yes, they had inquests in the 70s. Some might not even have known there was an inquest. In fact, families said afterwards that inquests had taken place. They never had even been informed. So it's not that inquests in the past weren't without their problems, but I think that there's a very clear mandate to provide an inquest and to provide full information, and that's what should be given to families. And we shouldn't be offering them any lesser alternative, or indeed putting them towards a process which fundamentally doesn't have trust, that people do not trust. So what's that saying to families? Yes, you were offered this, but no, you will take this. And I think we cannot underestimate how traumatising that is for families, and also in terms of the resources and fight needed to keep going. Because we shouldn't be sitting in 2025 with a legacy process not addressed. It shouldn't happen. I mean, when people sign for the Good Friday Agreement, it's on the basis that there would be a process that would come. And so we need to take due cognizance of the fact there's been a huge mental health, physical health consequence of legacy not being addressed here. And we need to get that right.
I think it all comes down to, doesn't it, government commitments. And if you look at the experience of the last 27 years, because it is important to go back before you can actually go forward. Let's look at what happened from 98 onwards with prisoner releases. We then had the decommissioning of weaponry. The ballistics and the evidence held the secrets to the crimes that were carried out, permanently put beyond use. Clean weaponry ending up in the hands of distant groupings in the years that followed. We then have the OTR saga. We have royal prerogatives of mercy. We have a Justice Minister of the Republic of Ireland state confirming that there was a moratorium placed on pre-1998 crimes. In practice, that the state would not go after people for those offences. That's the building blocks that have brought us to the point where we are now. So it depends where you come from in terms of your perspective around commitments that have not been lived up to. Because for many victims and survivors, there's been a quarter of a century of subversion of the criminal justice system, which has brought us to where we are today. And how much of that is going to be rowed back on? How much of that is in the gift of the government to now say, actually, there needs to be a rebalancing done here, and previous commitments we gave to terrorist organisations may not actually be worth anything now? That question won't be answered either.
Thanks.
Okay, Simon Hall wanted to come in there.
Thank you, Chair, and my apologies for having to duck out earlier. Can I try to inject a little bit of realistic realpolitik into this? The system that went before with inquests, some liked and some loathed. And quite a lot of that liking or loathing was determined by the outcomes, whether they found the outcomes palatable or not, and the timeliness by which they were accessed. And the trigger, no pun intended, but the trigger for trying to revisit resolving this legacy issue was the investigatory capacity of the PSNI and the bandwidth of capacity within the inquest system to accommodate demand. Nobody was particularly cock-a-hoop with the previous regime. Nobody was cock-a-hoop with the previous government's Legacy Act. And the evolving position of the new government appears to be attracting as many detractors and questions and dissatisfaction as before. And it strikes me as an interested but dispassionate observer that trying to alight upon something which can command public confidence from both traditions and all of the political representation, both north and south of the border and here in Westminster, is a nigh on impossible task. So my question is, and this is the cutting to the chase question, which may, Chair, render every other inquiry on this obsolete, is to try to bolster the inquest process through better resourcing, effectively redeploying the anticipated financial resources to deliver a new legacy settlement. It won't attract universal support or like, but it's a tried and tested system which can command some degree of confidence. It can deliver dispassionate justice, because certainly in previous conversations I've had over the years in this matter, there is a sharp distinction, and it's difficult to say in public because it's a hard thing for people to face into. There are some who do legitimately wish to see justice through the legacy resolution process. There are others who see this as a pursuit of vengeance, and vengeance and justice are two entirely different, counterintuitive, and mutually cancelling out things. So having said that rather long-winded preamble, Chair, for which I'm grateful to your patience, my question is, any government that tries to resolve this is on a hiding to nothing. Better the devil you know. Bolster the inquest process as imperfect as it is. Move on, and to pick up Mr. Donaldson on your sentiment, stop looking backwards and try to look forward and resource the better shaping of the future of Northern Ireland through the resources which are currently earmarked for deployment to try to solve a legacy problem which seems to have no problem which can command universal support or respect or engagement. Now, if you think there's any merit in that, please say so. If you think I've spoken absolute nonsense, please feel at liberty to say that's absolute nonsense as well, Simon. I will leave it to the three witnesses.
Nonsense.
Sorry?
Nonsense.
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Mann, I'm always endorsed by the fact if Mr. Robinson thinks I've talked nonsense. There must be a kernel of truth in what I've said.
Right. Kenny?
I think I very much disagree with you that if you don't actually go back and reflect upon things that have been done, whatever the motivations of them, then you don't actually have an understanding of how you can ever cure a problem. Drawing a line isn't going to resolve this. It never was. In 1998...
But pursuance of the inquest system is not a drawing the line. It's just resorting to what we've had in the past. That's not drawing a line. That's not pulling the curtains and saying let's just forget about it. It's just using the inquest system and not trying to create anything new. That's not drawing a line.
Just to be clear then, to be clear, are you saying the inquest process for all cases?
Yes.
Is that what you're proposing?
Yes.
Across the board?
Yes, apologies if that wasn't clear. Yes.
Yeah. And you've tested the financials on this?
It'll be no more expensive than anything else which is proposed to come forward in the round. Let's be absolutely frank. And what price justice?
Yeah. Look, it's an interesting, I suppose, suggestion. I think there would need to be a little bit of meat on the bone to actually decipher what exactly you're meaning by it, how it could in any way be progressed within a timeline and a time frame which is going to meet the needs of first generation victims. I think the bottom line of all this though is there needs to be an honesty. Is the state saying that punitive justice is closed, it's done, it's over, and that this is the best other solution that there is? And those questions have to be answered, because what I do agree with you is we don't want a tokenistic justice back on the table. If justice is back on the table, it needs to be a justice that you can go into a ring and slug it out, or it's worth nothing, because all that's happening is that victims and survivors are being psychologically tortured into believing that it's possible. So if there's honesties and transparencies around this, maybe there's a discussion to be had.
I think fundamentally one of the issues will be who will actually be eligible, and the eligibility could be quite small, and that will cut a sizable proportion of people out of the system. And that's why there has to be a process that is there and that is available for people who don't meet the criteria for inquests or indeed for anything else, but whose loved one was killed and who deserve a full investigation. I mean, the cost of not having something is that we hand it to the next generation. We're already doing that. We can see evidence of transgenerational trauma. As the trauma is handed down, people coming in wanting to investigate their grandfather's murder, or indeed taking on the mantle of responsibility when their loved ones are disappeared for the next... and I mean, that really is extremely sad to see that and to see how the next generation are impacted. So we have to do something. We also see the cost of deteriorating mental health, and that's huge. I mean, the best example of legacy that I have seen in my time, and I've been in WAVE since 1995. I worked as a nurse prior to that, so I come at this very much with a health lens on it. But the best example I've seen is Operation Canova, who genuinely put people at the heart of the process, who saw people through, people who had no confidence in Canova at the start. And to me, that's what we have advocated. Anyone who wants it, and not all families will want it, because people use there's 3,800, would bankrupt the place and whatever. Not all families want a process. Not all families will go down that route. but if they want it, then they should be entitled to an Operation Canova type process, which puts them at the centre of that process and delivers for them. And that's the best example of legacy that I have seen addressed for families, and that's what I would want to see.
I think it's an interesting proposal. I think, as Kenny has suggested, I think the finances on it might be hugely difficult. I think if you're proposing something that everyone can avail of, fair enough. But I do think, as Sandra has already suggested, that there is the model in Canova for working through this process, that it should be victim-centred, that victims and survivors should be at the heart of it. I know, having dealt with people in relation to Canova and then subsequently Operation Denton, the family liaison people have all done good work and they've made relationships with families, but I suppose the proof of the pudding will be in the eating of it, and what the outcomes actually are in the long run. And we've had an interim report, obviously, in relation to Canova, and we await the final report in relation to it. But I suppose one of the important things that should be learned from Canova is that, to a degree, the process was internationalised, that it was taken away from ourselves to a certain degree, that there was oversight that was put in place to ensure that things were being done properly, that victims and survivors were being treated properly through the process, that the investigation was being done to the highest standards that it possibly could have been. So I do think the bones of a process are there, and John Boucher, while he was heading up Canova, felt that it could be scaled up to look at the 3,700, 3,800 deaths, and that might be the most cost-effective way. I think the reason that the discussion around inquests is there is that there were a small cohort of people who had been promised that that's the process that they were going to get, and I think by the very nature of people, if you're promised something, you expect that.
Thank you.
I'm grateful. Thank you.
Alan, I wanted to bring something up with you. After our visit, I was shocked by the amount of redaction that I saw in the paperwork from Sean Brown's family. That level of redaction, if they were to go to ICRA, would still be there, or not?
Well, I suppose the file that you were showing that day was an 80 or a 58-page file,
Shocked.
and every single page was black and secret printed across the top of it. How is anyone supposed to get any information or knowledge out of that? But there was then 18 other files that were heavily redacted as well that Sean Brown's family got. I think in relation to the process, the coroner seen everything. He's seen all the information. Our understanding is that whatever commission would be in place would also see all of the information. But it's about the onward disclosure of the information, and it's about, we have to remember, if you take Sean Brown, for example, he was locking up the gates of a GAA club. He was a community man. He wasn't involved in any paramilitary organisation or any military organisation or any way. And you have to wonder, what are the levels of redaction? Why that level of redaction into relation to his murder? His murder that was committed after the ceasefires by the LVF, the Loyalist Volunteer Force. And you have to ask the question, why is that level of redaction involved in that particular murder? I can't really answer your question. I would think that I accept that there are national security issues, but I also cannot accept that there are national security issues that go to that level in relation to what is being described as a sectarian murder.
Gavin.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting discussion back and forth, and obviously this national security issue has been a bone of contention throughout the process of legacy and ICRIR. So as part of the consultations I was asking you earlier, have you had direct discussions about how families could at least have the comfort of knowing that when redactions are there for appropriate national security considerations, as you've accepted, that they are required and that they do engage issues of national security, and that so you don't get a document where whatever it is, 60 pages, 80 pages are blackened out, that the relevant material that needs to be protected can be? Are you having those mechanical conversations?
That we haven't had that conversation as yet, but and I think, you know, it is important, and it would be very important, and this is where this notion of trust comes into it, that you have to trust the process. And that's where, as I say, a number of families trusted the inquest process and trusted that they would get the answers and trusted that the legal system was working on their side. I think the difficulty that we currently have with the likes of the ICIR is that there doesn't seem to be that level of trust in the Commission as it currently stands. You know, we all see redacted documents whenever they come through to us, and you have to assume that they're done for the right reasons. But again, without someone being able to verify that and say, yes, that was redacted for a genuine national security reason. I mean, I've seen documents that have been redacted going back to the 1970s. If national security is based on the levels of things that were happening in the 1970s, I think we're in a very sad place, to be perfectly honest with you.
In court processes, you have special advocates.
Yeah.
Look at these things devoid of any interest, devoid of family interest, state interest, etc. And Sandra, is this something that you guys have been engaged in mechanically, how you can do it? Because it seems to me that if there's going to be an injection of confidence in this process, there needs to be a way in which Sir Declan has told us he can see everything. But whenever the Secretary of State has a decision to make, should it not be taking the view of somebody like Sir Declan to say, actually, this might be meritorious to protect, and the rest of it's not?
I think that we've seen the example of that, through Canova, Operation Canova, where they've no doubt there were huge national security issues that they dealt with, and yet for the response for what the families got, they understood that there would be things that they would never see, never have access to, would never hear, and that was firmly understood. But they trusted the process they were engaged in. And I think the other thing, Gavin, that was very clear is because the investigation team had not had any part to play in the policing within Northern Ireland, that was also something which, you know, so when they said X, Y or Z, then families could say, okay, you know, I understand that or whatever. And I'm very minded with Canova. I've seen some such really good work in terms even of people who were part of the investigation process coming back to engage with Canova, and for families to see that actually that process, how that process worked in action. So it fundamentally goes down to the issue of, do you trust the process or not? Do you trust the people involved? And have they any prior relationship to what has happened here? And therefore, it goes back to what Alan said, and we have said on an ongoing basis that this needs to have very clear outside. It must be managed and undertaken by people who come from outside our jurisdiction.
Sorry, Chair, I don't feel like I've intervened, but maybe Kenny has a...
Yes, I mean, I suppose I go back to the point made around, is this about doing the minimum or the optimum for all whom are participants in this? And the national security issue, obviously, given the levels of distrust that exist right across society, the two states have got to give maximum disclosure at this point to try and provide even some context to circumstances. We've always argued that the good, the bad and the ugly should be put out on the table, because it's no worse, it can be no worse than actually what is believed within our society, which often is not based upon reality. So to us that would be a positive thing. But I go back as well to, this is not alone an issue with the states. We have tested this circumstance of, will individuals be named who were involved in murders in the 70s, who are now dead? And the likelihood is they will not. And that is something that victim survivors find very, very challenging to deal with. That they would not know at least the individuals involved, and indeed the command teams that were involved in those operations, because they know that their loved one was murdered by a member of a prescribed terror organisation, by a terrorist organisation. They know, if they're from a security force background, that it was deemed that they were legitimate targets for it. They know that. They want to know the personnel who were involved in actually orchestrating all of that. How do they get that accountability through this process, or through anything else that could replace it? Because you're not going to bring any level of satisfaction to them unless you can achieve that.
Thanks. Yeah. Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you all very much for coming today. A few questions about the ICRIR, and I'll take the first of those questions. This is obviously an institution that was created as a consequence of the Legacy Act. We've taken oral testimony and written testimony from academics and NGOs in which the trustworthiness, the legitimacy of that organisation has undoubtedly been brought into question. And as Alan talked about before, the issue of trust, of course, is fundamental to all of this. So can I ask you in this first block of questions about the ICRIR, given that this institution, we're told, is going to live on beyond perhaps the repeal of the Legacy Act, is there anything, in your opinion, that can be done by the government and by the ICRIR itself to increase trustworthiness in that organisation? Given the government's commitment to try and increase trustworthiness in it. Sandra, perhaps I could come to you first on that one, and then Alan, and then I'll finish off with Kenny.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be very different views in terms of whether people feel that it can be reformed at all, or whether there can be changes made to it that will, in terms of buy-in, the necessary trust needed. And there'll be very clear arguments on both sides about that. I think the reality is that there needs to be, the legislative framework in which it works allows for limitations, and where the role of the Secretary of State sits in relation to being able to determine information provided. I go back to Canova, where it was a police investigation, so it was a full criminal justice investigation, and that's where I saw the benefit for families that they'd never had, and that's what I do believe all families deserve. There's very clear issues around the structure and governance, in terms of the fact that I do believe that I think our history shows us that over time we have needed outside help, whether it's in the Good Friday Agreement, whether it was in terms of decommissioning, whether it was in terms of other aspects of work. And I think that there needs to be a very clear independence and governance arrangement that is outside Northern Ireland. And that there are structures and oversight needs to be very, very clear. And also in relation to the approach to victims' services, because what I can see from individuals coming forward is that, is that they are, we want to know what questions you want, and it's to shoehorn people down into quite a narrow framework, which will be light touch review. Because quite frankly, families don't know what they don't know, and that's where they need to have full access to information. And that's something which I don't believe that, as ICRIR sits, that they will do. And I believe that what families will get will be a process that's probably lighter than HET was all those years ago. And the consequence of that is huge, because we have investigative journalists who will unpick and will look and will study areas. And so imagine a family going through that and they ask their questions, and in 5 years' time an article is published which is revelations that family knew nothing about, and they look back and say, I engaged with ICRIR, they never told me any of that. You know, how damaging is that not for families? They deserve to have the fullest account if that's what they wish, because not all families will enter those processes. So I think that there is a huge issue around trust, around independence and around governance. And I think that if ICRIR was to remain, then fundamentally it would change beyond recognition.
It would change or should change?
It would change, have to change beyond recognition.
Yeah, I can't disagree with anything Sandra has said, to be honest. I think we probably need to go back to the origins of the ICIER, the origins of the Legacy Act, and for the vast majority of the families that the Pat Finucane Centre work with, they would see that as a commitment from the last Conservative government to protect veterans, and that's how they see it. And how, if that may be right, that may be wrong, but that's how it is seen. So I think you have to get over that analysis in the first place, and I think that will be very, very difficult for the ICIR as it currently stands to do, because everyone who, and especially the chief commissioners, were employed during a time when amnesty was still in place, and when when the reason and the rationale for the whole body was to protect veterans. I don't believe that necessarily that was the reason, the rationale. I think it probably goes deeper than that. In relation to independence, I think we've touched on Canova a number of times this morning, but one of the main selling points to Canova was that it was independent. It was people who were not seen to be party to the conflict, who were engaged in the process of investigation or review. And I go back again to something that I mentioned earlier, that we need to internationalise this process. We need to get help from outside. Every time we've had a stumbling block, a sticking block along the way, we've internationalised the process. And that doesn't mean to say that we're doing anything wrong. I think it's a different set of eyes. It's a different way of looking at things. It's a different way of seeing things. I know the Secretary of State a number of times has talked about building trust in the ICRIR. It isn't happening. I don't see it happening, sorry. This is a body that on the 1st of May will have been operational for 12 months and was in shadow form for 12 months before that. And the numbers of people who are coming to it are small compared to the numbers of people who are bereaved or seriously injured through the period of the conflict. So, to me, that's the biggest indictment of the ICRIR. It's not the people, it's not the processes, it's people do not trust it and are not coming forward for whatever reason. People will have different reasons for it. I'm only giving you the reasons that the people that I work along with are given to us as an organisation.
You can't change your parents, and the Legacy Act is the parent of the ICRIR. So are you saying that this is an institution that is is beyond the ability to generate trust because it will always have that origin story?
I think personally, yes. I do think, as Sandra has already said, if it is a body that is going to gain trust, it will be something that looks absolutely nothing like the ICIR currently looks. And I know you've had Daniel Holder in from CAJ, and their report talked about root and branch change, and that obviously come from something that Michael Martin had said. I think that is the case. It does have to be root and branch change.
Thank you. Kenny.
The parents of all these processes are the establishment. All right. So again, 27 years, the establishment has been at the helm, and we look back at the point whenever this was brought through, obviously in Parliament, and not to get party political about it here, but the level of opposition at that stage did question, a lot of victims' favours questioned the sort of conversations that were being had across parties, because it suited a lot of people for this to be taken off the table. And there was a very public position by Northern Ireland political parties sometimes, and maybe there would have been private positions held by individuals also.
Parties.
Yep, accepted. So it's this process, as we see it, there certainly needs to be an external dimension to it, agreed. But there also can be no ideological waging against particular individuals who can or cannot serve within it. Because there are all sorts of mechanisms and conflicts of interest checks that can be put in place around particular cases. That can be done if the will is there. What we would say as well is that this should not be looked at purely in the context of individual casework, examination of crimes in that manner. There's an absolute need to have thematics running concurrently with this. Because the biggest damage that there is within our society as well is the misnomers around particular issues which are felt very, very deeply within particular communities. And two of them, to give us an example. Some people believe the British soldiers were standing at corners and streets and picking off civilians as target practice in that crude way. And in the earlier days of our troubles from 68 through to 75, if you look at the concentration of death which was caused by the military versus what happened from the years thereafter, it wasn't that it ceased, but the numbers were much smaller. Examinations around the context of what was going on, the training, the environment to which soldiers were brought from and into the space of Northern Ireland. That all needs to be looked at. But also there's also another belief around that the Republic of Ireland state were effectively a wing with the Provisional IRA, which again doesn't stand up to real scrutiny. However, from the period of 68 to 75, you have to look at the policy that was in place around security and extradition, around the arms crisis, which has never had any real international dimension or probing exactly what was going on within a government. You also have to look at the histories of the factories in the Republic, the production of gelignite, the production of armaments, and where that ended up, and what the efforts were to secure that particular material before it crossed the border and was used in the murder of individuals. So there's a huge amount in all of that has to be done.
And the ICRAR have not got the competency or trust in order to get to the bottom of those issues.
On their own, I think it's going to be very, very challenging. We have a small caseload of families who have come forward to us and who have insisted that they wish to engage with ICRA, and they've done so on the basis that there has been very, very little other option available for them. And they are becoming more aged, and they see this as a hope as opposed to any real certainty of outcome, and they're engaging. But we're not at a point yet where we can make any real judgment around its success or otherwise. It's still within those earlier stages.
So you mentioned there, Kenny, families who have come to you and who have gone on to use the services, facilities of the ICRAR, and perhaps it's an impossible question because there are presumably lots of families who are not engaging with the process. From the conversations that you may have with those families, what are the key reasons that people give to say, I don't want to engage with this particular institution, the ICRAR? Why are people not coming forward in greater numbers?
Well, I think there's obviously a huge noise around it all, in terms of the public speak of it. There's obviously, when we go through and do our own analysis of what's there, obviously we're speaking to victims and survivors, and they are themselves also, because we need to not patronise victim survivors. They can make their own calls on these issues as well. Some are very astute and understanding, and they can smell a rat. But it has to be said, we're still in this stage of the unknown. I know that the experience that the families who have engaged with it to date, on the basis of how the process has treated them, the individuals concerned, there's some positives there, but the same circumstance just as Canova was. You look at what the outcome of all of this is for people. And different people judge an outcome in different ways, what means a good outcome. And the other thing that people need to understand as well as a victim survivor, whilst they may not all put their hands up and say, I'm motivated by justice at this point, it's because they've been conditioned to believe it's impossible. And then they're in a space, what is my next best option here? But actually most people in their hearts would want actual justice. But it isn't there for them.
Sandra, and then Alan, that same question. Why are people not coming forward in your experience?
I think there's a number of things. I think actually, I looked at the figures yesterday for us in the last year with over 900 bereaved families in, bereaved individuals in. And so when you think of ICRA's levels, and that's just us, and obviously Kenny would have a sizable caseload, and so would Alan, their levels are not high. So we have a small number of people in the system. It seems to, and I've checked in terms of how they're faring through that. I suppose it's very early days. What I would say is that I have concerns when people have very particular issues around age or life-limiting conditions that they should be fast-tracked, and that seems to be very slow. So that's regrettable. But I think that there is the overall issue is that fundamentally the background to where ICRA came from was in relation to the prior in terms of the legislative framework, and people viewed that extremely negatively. There was such an outcry in relation to that, and the various people within ICRA signed up to that legislation, and therefore in a way they endorsed that legislation. Now they will say it wasn't their legislation, and therefore the courts will make the decision. But the reality is the courts shouldn't have had to make the decision. The legislation should have been right from day one, and we shouldn't be putting people into a system that compromises them or indeed makes it difficult for them. So I think that people are waiting and wanting to see. They want to see what the government's going to do. No pressure, but they do want to see what the government's going to do. They want to see what changes are going to come before they make their decision. Are the issues, and some of you met people within WAVE, are the issues as important to them? Absolutely. And they want to see a process that works for them. But at the moment they feel they can't engage in that process that is there. And it goes down to lack of trust, lack of confidence. And the origins of where it came from meant that people signed up to legislation that, yes, may subsequently be changed, but essentially the origins haven't given it a strong foundation.
Alan, final word to you.
Yeah, unlike Kenny and Sandra, none of the families that we currently work with have even gone to the ICIR, have even tipped their toe in the bathwater, even so to speak. And I suppose I go back to the things I mentioned earlier. It's its origins, its genesis. As Sandra has just said there now, the people who are in the process, are in the commission, engaged in it whenever people were saying there's something wrong here, even as it was going through Parliament. There were a number of attempts, especially in the House of Lords, to make changes to make bad law better law, and even they were rejected. So I think that all has played, and people have seen this, and it was played out in public and in the open, and people have seen that. And I think the other point is, as Sandra's already said as well, but I would reiterate it, is if you're having to go through the courts to decide whether what you're doing is legal and right, there's something wrong with the process from the very, very start, in my opinion. There should have been a process put in place that said, we can legally do what we're entitled to do here. We can work this system for the best benefit for as many people as possible and in as quick a period of time. And that isn't a process that is sitting there on the table at the minute.
Thank you all very much.
Claire Hannah.
Thank you. Thanks very much to all of our witnesses. I just want to come back to the issue of separating the truth-seeking and the investigative processes, and the, I suppose, the government's saying that they will pursue some of the successful elements or the perceived successful elements from Stormont House. What benefit would that have? Alan, I might start with you.
The separation of the two. I think going back to Stormont House, and I accept that not everyone accepted Stormont House, but there was a good degree of acceptance there. I think it was really important at that time to have a truth-seeking process and an investigative process, and that was acknowledged at the time. And there was a lot of work and a lot of talk around sequencing of that process and how it should happen. So obviously, people who are greater minds than me had thought through this process and thought there needs to be two different processes. I think there are reasons for that. Some people will want just a truth-seeking type process where they can go, I have X, Y, and Z questions. I'm not interested in seeing someone going through the courts. I've said that in relation to the killing of my own father. That's not something. I don't want to see an 80-year-old man sitting in the dock. He or she will have their family, and I don't want to see that. I don't think it needs to be brought to another generation. That's a personal opinion. I know others differ on that. So they will come with their specific questions through a truth-seeking process. There are others that want a judicial, legal process. But I also think there is an overlap at different times, because the information that comes through a truth-seeking process, and I suppose that when we talk about a truth-seeking process, we're talking about information that may come from ex-paramilitaries or whatever, and that has to be verified. It can't.
What sort of verification mechanisms?
It can't be just, that's a justification for what we were doing. So that's why I'm saying there is a sequencing needs to be done there.
Do you have any confidence in the exploration of what those verification measures could be?
I think, again, I don't want to keep coming back to Canova, but there is a process there that they will have dealt with ex-members of the IRA or members of the IRA, and they will have heard information there, and they will have had to go and check whether what is being said is correct or not. I think there are processes there that have been done, have been tried, but I do think it is really important to keep the two separate, because there's no way someone is going to come forward with information if they think it's going to end up in an investigative process. So I know that sounds a bit convoluted in how I'm saying that, but there is a way of doing it. It has to be separated, in my opinion. And I know I'm not explaining that awful well, but that's...
Sandra, do you have views on the viability of separating it, and what that would mean for families as they seek either of those two outcomes?
I think that's quite a difficult issue. In some ways, Alan said, I think Canova demonstrated how it had been done and how it should be done. I think that was useful because they were able to verify whether the information they were receiving was accurate or not accurate. There's no doubt that if there is a process for people to give information, that would be valuable. However, I would not hold out massive expectations around it. I go back to actually our work with the families that disappeared, where there's very clear legislation. And information has taken a long time to come, and to be quite truthful, at times it's really around continuing to push, harangue, and continue to try to make people see that actually what you're looking for is to recover a body as opposed to anything else. And if they have information, they should come. So I think anyone who says a truth-seeking process will get a lot of information and people will come willingly, I would be very, very sceptical of that. I really would, based on my experience of dealing with the families that disappeared. I think the Canova model, I think, should be looked at in its fullest sense, because I do believe that has given us the fullest account for families that they've never had, and I think has probably dealt with some of those very issues that you're looking to tease out, and I think that's what should be explored.
some colleagues will pick up on the Canova. Kenny, you've spoken about the profile of the cases that your organisations deal with, and I suppose the desirability of an individual name rather than a corporate narrative. But what accountability and verification mechanisms do you think can exist for non-state actors, and have you had any confidence that there is work going in to achieve those, or do your members have any confidence that there will be outcomes?
Thanks for the question, Claire. I suppose it's only a matter of a couple of weeks ago we sat in a panel in Stormont Hotel on a legacy discussion panel, Alan and I and Judith, the former Victims Commissioner Judith Thompson. And look, this issue was being discussed that day, and certainly what was coming back from loyalism and on the fringes republicanism as well was that they are not committed to providing anything further, and that presents a really big problem in all of this. A corporate narrative is not going to bring us any further than where we currently are. And people ask, why do individuals require to know whom was involved and whom actually orchestrated a particular atrocity? Northern Ireland is a small place, granted, and many people over the years have had feelings and beliefs that particular individuals may have been involved in atrocities. They could be their neighbours, and that has destroyed relationships over the years. The paranoia levels that exist because of that. And actually, are those folks not entitled to clarity, to a peace of mind, if the information exists? There aren't going to be people that I can assure you who we work with are going to pick up a gun and go out and seek revenge. They would have acted on it already, were they to have done so. But they surely are entitled to absolute clarity around who and why. And there hasn't been enough of a pressure point placed on prescribed organisations or those who give guidance and oversight to them. And it's whether or not there is anything can be done around that to put a pressure point on them, because they're not going to do so willingly. Sadly, we don't have a circumstance in Northern Ireland where people have been humbled to believe and to understand at this stage that things have to change. We're consigning, there's two Northern Irelands have grown up. We have the peace dividend in Northern Ireland post 1998, where some people are enjoying a very, very good quality of life, and it could be akin to anywhere across these counties over here. But there are others who are locked in a state of not being able to move fully forward with their life because there is this constant psychological torture, you could call it, that they just don't know what is around them. They don't know the people. They don't know who they can trust. And when terrorism continues in a very disparate way as well, and that happens in action, then that brings them back even further to where they were. So how do we basically lessen the chasm between those two groupings of people? That's the real challenge at this stage. And it has grown to be quite a difference over that last quarter of a century.
Yeah, okay. David Smith.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming in today, and nice to see some of you again. Thinking about the ICRA model, one of the core elements of the original model was conditional immunity for people coming to it with information, and now those provisions have been deemed incompatible with ECHR. Could you say how you would envisage participation by and truth recovery from former paramilitaries or former terrorists without that condition?
I think it's extremely challenging. I think it was challenging with it, to be straight, because people have been able to move forward with their lives to an extent for the last 30, 40 years from they committed these crimes without the law being applied and them being held accountable. So with that being removed, obviously there's absolutely zero compulsion on their part unless they've come to a stage in life where they feel, I want to contribute to a better Northern Ireland, and that requires me to self-reflect upon what I was involved in. And people have to come to a space of being able to divide the two issues. I believed I had a grievance, whether that was real or perceived within the context of Northern Ireland, versus that gives me the human right to then use violence to actually settle a score. Because the two have become now intermeshed, and that's a very dangerous narrative that we have, that a human grievance entitles you to use violence. No, it doesn't. The grievance has to be dealt with, and there are political pathways for it to be dealt with. But it never ever justified the use of criminal violence and the pursuance of that.
Thanks, Kenny. Sandra or Alan on that question of...
I think that, I go back to the problems of conditional immunity and the thought that you will get sizable amounts of information and the sort of promise that if that's in place that would happen. I think that I go back to the Canova model in terms of, obviously, if there's evidential opportunities are taken. But if they're not there, I am sure there are ways that people can be looked at in relation to whether they're considered, how they're considered, and information can come. And I think that's something which is very important. I think the best example and what we can see is that the reality is that the records that are held within the state system gives the records that are there and were recorded at the time. And that gives families the best example in terms of understanding and knowing what has actually happened in the past. And if further information comes in around that, then it's of benefit. But that needs to be a criminal justice investigation to get that level of access.
Just if I'll give you a chance to come in, Alan, but if I can just piggyback off of that point there, Sandra, maybe you can address this as well, Alan, if you want, but is there an elephant in the room in respect of, you just talked about the state's records and resources? Well, a charitable look at it would say paramilitaries didn't keep those kinds of records, or what they did, not comparable to what the state might have kept. And so obviously we keep talking about Canova, and it by all accounts sounds like it's a good model, but could we hope from an alternative process like Canova without conditional immunity that even if people who were involved in violence before from a paramilitary background were willing, as Kenny was saying, to come forward out of a moment of self-reflection and reflect back, this is what I did, that those that weren't, that would we ever be able to understand what actually happened or not? I suppose I'll open that to anyone, but especially Alan, if that's okay, just given that you've not had a chance yet.
I think in relation to conditional immunity, we should actually remember why it was in the legislation in the first place. And it was in the legislation in the first place, according to the last Conservative government, to protect vets. And it was only extended to others because the government was told you can't do it for one and not the other. So I think this notion that the conditional immunity was to try and engage paramilitary organisations to come forward, we need to put that bit to bed, in my opinion. I have to agree with both Kenny and Sandra. You're not going to get a flood of people coming through the door going, I did this, and I'm really sorry, and whatever. That isn't a reason not to have some sort of a body there to actually take that information should someone get that road to Damascus experience. In relation to state records, and we hear this mentioned on numerous occasions, that paramilitaries didn't keep records. The state kept records about paramilitaries. The state very rarely kept records about their own wrongdoing. So I think there's a bit of a fallacy there. In relation to is there a way of encouraging people maybe in? You know, under the Good Friday Agreement, anyone who was convicted of a troubles-related offence, the maximum sentence they could receive was 2 years. And I know some work has been done by some academics to suggest that that could be down to 0. It could, you know, you could go through a legal process and whatever, but the maximum sentence you get is 0, which sounds ridiculous, I know. But so I don't know if that's a feasible way of dealing with this, but I think we do have to be realistic. You're not going to get hundreds and hundreds of people who are involved in paramilitary organisations or ex-British soldiers or ex-RUC men or UDR men or whatever coming forward to say this is what I did during the period of the conflict.
Just moving on, I want to move on to the next question, but just quickly on that, can we have a realistic expectation that a Canova type approach, for example, would see hundreds of the unsolved or unknown about acts of violence that happened during the Troubles uncovered? Is that realistic? You know, if you pick a number in terms of the number of people affected, you know, who want truth recovery, could you multiply Canova 100 times, 200 times, 300 times?
I can only take John Boucher's word for it. As John Boucher put in place the Canova type model, and he has said that he believes it can be scaled up. And as Sandra has already suggested as well, not everyone will want to come forward and find out information about what actually happened. A lot of people have decided that's there, it's in the past, and I'm moving forward and looking forward and whatever. But as Sandra has already mentioned also, grandchildren are now coming forward and saying, what happened to my grandfather, my grandmother, my granduncle, aunt, whatever. And a lot of that is because it wasn't talked about within the family. Don't know your mum, don't know your mother, don't know your father, don't talk about that. You know, so people know that there is a history in their family, and we are inquisitive people. We like to know, like, I mean, how many sites are there out there in relation to ancestry and whatever, and the programmes on the telly. So we do want to know about our history, and I think we do need to know about our history. We need to know about our history to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes all over again. And while it may be difficult for a period of time to hear the shocking things that happened and to have it readdressed and looked at, I think we need to be doing it sooner rather than later, is a personal opinion. I'm mindful of time that we're taking here, and feel free to chip in. I'll ask the next question. You can also answer the ones before, but we wanted to ask about reconciliation being the principal objective of ICRA. What's your view on that, especially when the Commission says it doesn't have a definition of reconciliation? Alan was just talking about, you know, understanding our past. For instance, that's an element of it potentially, but Sandra?
I mean, I think this is quite difficult because in some ways it gets very close to victim blaming. That reconciliation, some suggestion that victims and survivors need to be reconciled. And certainly there was a sense that because for many victims and survivors, yes, there are some people who really find it very difficult, but for many, they would bear no ill against anyone else. They're the most progressive people you will ever meet. And I think that the difficulty is, there was some suggestion that in some ways we have to put reconciliation in, that in some ways that this is what is required to do. If this is about wider societal reconciliation, then that's a different process altogether. I mean, I've seen the benefit when I look back in terms of and I worked with a number of the families for a long time and saw the end of Canova with them as they came through the end process. And for many, there was a sense that because the information they got was actually not as bad as what they had imagined for years, and I think Kenny has alluded to that. Sometimes people's imagination was so much more destructive to them I'm not saying the information wasn't painful. Of course it was. I'm not saying it wasn't difficult. I'm not saying that people didn't struggle with it. Of course they did. But actually it provided some solace as well as a sense of greater understanding. And for some people, they also found out that the police force at the time had actually done a number of, very clear things in terms of the investigation process that they never had learnt. And in fact, actually, some of those people came back to assist Canova. Now, for them, there was a real sense of a greater understanding that the police had not maybe acted in the way that they had once assumed that they did, and that they had greater understanding that people were still believed enough in their loved one to continue to want to help the process, that if it would give them a better outcome or give them a better understanding, that they would do that. And to me, that is a process cannot be underestimated in relation to the benefit of it. So I am concerned in terms of, there is a reconciliation framework, and what we understand in terms of ICRA is that they want to ensure that, they ask families what would reconciliation look like for them. And for some people, they really struggle with why are they being asked that? What's the appropriateness of being asked that? And is there some suggestion they need that? And yet that couldn't be further from the truth.
Final question, but to open to everyone in that context, and feel free to agree or disagree with Sandra, but is the alignment of the goal of reconciliation and a quasi-judicial process helpful? Should the two things have anything to do with each other is really the question.
Reconciliation to me is a personal thing. It's not something that can be forced on me or on anyone else by an act of Parliament. I think you reconcile because you work out whatever your differences are or whatever your perceived differences are. I think, again, sorry to go back to the legislation as it was first enacted, I think the word reconciliation was inserted there to ensure that if a case ever went the whole way to the European Court of Human Rights, that the amnesty part or the conditional immunity part had some sort of backing, because the European Court has said that in certain peace agreements amnesty is appropriate. You can call me a cynic if you want, but whenever reconciliation isn't even outlined within the bill as to what it means and what it looks like, I think that's the reason it's there. I think it's very cynical, to be perfectly honest with you. I think the community in Northern Ireland are well capable of reconciling with themselves and with each other. And I also think Sandra's right. It's not just about the two communities. I mean, there's two islands here that need to properly reconcile with each other as well.
I think again, to feed on to that point, maybe Sandra, around the victim blaming issue, that there's always this position has been put on victims that you either forgive or you're in a state of vengeance. And actually, the vast majority of victim survivors are in a third place. They have what I would term righteous anger. They genuinely have a right to be angry with how they have been treated. And reconciliation is no substitution for accountability. If we think about in context of our everyday lives, whenever we have a disagreement with someone, in order for that relationship to in any way be repaired, there must be accountability. Forgiveness even may come, that doesn't guarantee reconciliation. And there has been a real lack of, I think, 25 years as well we've had of a peace and reconciliation industry in Northern Ireland, which has in many ways brought us to a point now where reconciliation is a very loaded term that means very little anymore, because it was used as a crutch to secure resources often, to be straight. And people within their hearts were not necessarily in a place of motivation to move beyond and to stretch themselves. It was being done for different reasons. So there's a bigger debate around what that concept of reconciliation has meant for Northern Ireland the last 25 years. But certainly attaching it to a bill of this nature was saw very, very cynically. And if you were to talk to, I think, as well to the faith community, I think they would be very, very strong on that issue as well, that it was certainly not helpful to what was being proposed.
Madam Georgie.
Thank you very much, Chair. Happy St Patrick's Week to you all. Thank you for...
Increased to a week now, is it?
Well, it'll be a month soon after
it will
5
be
years
a
Labour government.
It was whenever I was a student.
Thank you all for making the effort to be here and for bringing the sun with you too. Since we saw you all in Northern Ireland, I've been thinking a lot about the Van family that we spoke to, Alan, and to Margaret and Ruth, and so do pass our thanks to them. They were very powerful stories, and Gareth's scones, my wife enjoyed the one that I took home for her, so please say thank you to him too. We call them scones. I want to just talk gently on the UK-Ireland relationship in relation to legacy, and you've all, thanks to Mr Robinson in his earlier questions, gently touched on the role of the Irish government, but I want to know if you can just give us a flavour of your view on the Irish government's engagement with the legacy process. Start with you, Sandra.
Well, we have an ongoing engagement with the Irish government in relation to the need to ensure that there's a process available for families who have been affected in Ireland, or indeed who have, or people who have been abducted in the north and brought down into the south, which was quite commonplace throughout the Troubles. And we, I suppose, have had concerns in relation to what that may mean, because initially it was looked at as cold case Garda review, or indeed other changes, and so we have pushed that the government would have a process, in fact actually that they would lead the way in terms of having a process that would meet the needs of families, with a very robust process in terms of investigative process. And we have undertaken that over time. We've also had more recent discussion with them in relation to the ongoing issues around separating out truth-seeking and investigative processes, and in terms of what mechanism that might be. And at one stage there was a suggestion really from both the NIO and from the Irish government in terms of looking at the disappeared legislation and that sort of model in relation to seeking information, and we would want to see that process remain very clearly for that process only, i.e. recovering the bodies of those disappeared. So there's no doubt, I think, that there is a need to ensure that this process and the changes that come are in relation to both governments, and that there's a very clear equality of process on either side of the border. That needs to be clear. I think over time the situation has changed for, in some ways, in relation to greater support for the bereaved, greater support in other areas. But there are schemes and processes such as the Troubles Permanent Disablement Pension Scheme, for instance, or payment scheme, that individuals in the South are not eligible for. And so there are very clear inequity, really, in relation to the treatment of people. And we would want to see that levied, as well as a very clear legacy process being in place.
That's very helpful, thank you. Now, Kenny, earlier on you said a failure to deal with legacy infects the present, and I believe that was in relation to the beginning of this conversation. I wonder if you could give us your view on the Irish government's engagement with the legacy process.
Hands off. A little bit of, we've used a phrase, I suppose, before, where there's a sense that there's a moral superiority around what happened in our Troubles, that the Irish state somehow had a neutral observer status, and that's a huge cultural change to bring about, that actually there's a acknowledgement, no, we were an active participant. And I think certainly over the last few years there's been more talk done, there's been more positive musings around what could happen, but there has never been any meat put on bones. And at this stage it's not it's not a viable position for the Irish government to take any longer. They're being asked the questions by their own citizens in the Republic. People from all communities in Northern Ireland are asking the questions, and they have got to move. Because what this all comes down to is, do we want a fair and equitable outcome to all of this, which is going to mean that two nation states are going to have the potential for positive relationships going forward, which I think everybody around this table would want. And those relationships have been frayed over the last number of years without question. But if there is a resolution which creates a sense within one partner that there has been an overly zealous use upon them and not coming the other way, then that presents a big problem. And it comes back to what we've said before. What are people really in this for? Are they about bringing progress and resolution for victims and survivors, and about aiding our two wonderful states to exist alongside one another and to be successful? Or is it about settling old scores and somehow moving the guilt to someone else without actually being prepared to self-reflect ourselves? And nobody gets out easy in this. So they do have to certainly move on that. And we have a number of cases along that border which we have sought to move forward with them, and we are hitting a brick wall currently. I hope that there can be movement. We use, I suppose, example as well that for some victims and survivors and groupings in Northern Ireland, the idea of former members of the RUC being involved in processes is challenging for them. Likewise, it's challenging for those whom believe there was collaboration between the Provisional IRA and An Garda Síochána to have confidence that the Gardaí could oversee a process south of the border to aid and bring resolution around all of this. So you always have to look at it from the perspective of the victim survivor on the ground and their given circumstances. And this is very, very complex.
Yeah. Thanks. Alan.
I probably haven't gotten an awful lot more to say other than what I mentioned earlier, that at each occasion when we meet people from the Department of Foreign Affairs, we say to them, look, you need to be doing more. You need to be stepping up to the plate here as well. Kenny made the point there that there are no neutral observers. I would make the point that that's across the board. I don't think anyone has clean hands in the period of the conflict, the troubles, the legacy, whatever you want to call it. I think Professor Thomas Leahy has done a lot of work in relation to what the role of the Irish government has been in relation to legacy, and he has pointed out, the deficiencies in that. And I think if anyone's looking for a steer on it, that's a good place to look. In relation to going back to the Stormont House Agreement again, the information recovery body that was part of that process, the ICIR, had set up a cross-border agreement or treaty for information recovery, but we made the point at the time that there should have been a historical investigations unit similar to that. It shouldn't just have been about information recovery, it should have been about investigations as well. So as I say, every time we meet the Irish government or people, representatives, we say, look, you need to be stepping up to the plate, and I think they get that. I'm just not sure they know yet how they go about doing that.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's uniformity there in the answers, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
Liam. Thank you all very much for coming today, and it's great to see those of you again that we saw recently. From my last visit to Belfast, I'm particularly interested in Operation Canova. What do you think are the particular lessons that this government should draw from Operation Canova? If I start with you, Kenny.
It has to be said, we as an organisation wouldn't have had as much of a touch point with Canova as the other two groupings here represented today. But of those whom we do have connect with, I suppose some of the responses they would have said was that they did feel very much involved at all levels of the process. They felt they were treated with respect. They felt that there was a will to bring the maximum possible information, that it wasn't that they were being palmed off as such. So there, what comes back to though again, and this depends on from what eyes you're coming through. Obviously, there were 30 odd cases went before the PPS, and none of those have actually ended in obviously prosecution, taken forward, etc. So some will judge that as not being a successful outcome. Others will say that we didn't expect that to be the case anyway, but it was more about obtaining that information and that confirmation of maybe some issues that they needed response to. So certainly in the rounds, Operation Canova would have had a more favourable view of it than any other legacy process. Wasn't cheap though, no, for what was involved, and the scaling up. There would need to be some serious work done around what the finances would be around that, which is going to be factored in by the government's decision.
Thank you very much. Sandra, do you want to come in?
Obviously, as I've said, we worked with Operation Canova from the very start. And at the very start, we asked families, what is your, what information have you before you? What's your levels of trust? Do you think this process will deliver? What are your levels of motivation? And quite frankly, people said, it'll not produce anything. This is a process where they're bringing an English copper in to investigate his own, and quite simply that nothing will be found. And for some people to say there were, in fact, actually across all the families, there was no one saying, yes, this will be really good, because they'd also had other processes in the past. And one of the young men said that he had met some of the investigators who had come in the past pre-Canova, and they said, we'll be back to you. And he said, that's the last I saw him, and it was in Belfast City Airport. So you can understand why people really were very, very sceptical that anything would happen. Within 18 months, that had moved, because people saw the process starting to move and starting to get information. They started to see that the systems and process of family liaison continuity, that the people who were in, obviously, many of them had retired, so the people they started with were the people they've ended with. That's huge, when you have that level of continuity. When they saw that the structures in place were around good governance, so the steering group was made up of entirely people from outside Northern Ireland, with the exception of Baroness Nulo Lone, that the governance structures had very clear pyramids, or very clear pillars in relation to how governance was managed. And of course, they had the experience of somebody who was leading that, who was from outside Northern Ireland, but who had huge experience in relation to terrorism and terrorism legislation in relation to John Boucher. And they got the process right from the start. They didn't come in with flawed legislation and say, well, actually, let's make the courts decide, and it may change within a number of months. They had the process right from the very start, and that's what made a huge difference. And I know that when I look at families who've come through, what they'll talk about is information is power, information is control. I now have a sense of what happened to my loved one. I've been given the full account of that in relation to of what can be provided. They talk about the sense that it was not as bad in some cases as what they imagined, what they thought had happened, and what over years. And remember, myth becomes reality, and it becomes fed, and the stories are fed. So for them, in terms of finding out information, was deeply painful. Did they struggle with it? Absolutely. Has it been painful? Absolutely. Has it been traumatic? Absolutely. But I think what made a difference was that Canova from the very start made sure that they were trauma-informed, they were trained, made sure they were sensitive to the nuances of working with families in Northern Ireland, in terms of the language they used, the approach they used, where they would see people. All of those things, they may seem very small, but they're major. And they also always acknowledged the death of the individual on their anniversary, which was huge. So it wasn't just an investigation, it went beyond that. I know Kenny will, and I can understand when people will say 30 cases went into the PPS, no cases come out as a prosecution. Is that how you judge Canova? and there's no doubt that people have focused on that. But the reality was that case determination came after the main subject was dead. So so therefore, what those cases then ceased to be cases. Even unfortunately, the way the law works, families were not allowed to be told whether there would have been a prosecution in that case because the subject had died. So I don't think it should be viewed on the basis of money, and I don't think on the basis of prosecutions. I think that is not, and certainly from the family's perspective, that's not something they would see. And they saw those cases go forward. For them, it was actually the process and the journey itself that made a huge difference. And that's what I've seen. I've seen how that's actually freed families. And families who were very isolated in relation to the circumstances of why their loved one died, and that intra-community conflict and the intimacy of violence, which I think is seldom understood, that for families getting back and being able to know and to understand and to have the fullest sense of their loved one's case was huge. The NPCC looked at whether Canova could be upscaled. And the arguments for government at that time were, it's too expensive, it couldn't be done. But I go back to my point earlier, not all families would want a Canova type investigation. Not all families, sadly people have died who would have been the main representatives within the family. So I think you're looking at a lot smaller number, and certainly there is a chance that, the NPCC said that it could be upscaled, and I think it's a model that should be looked at.
Thank you, Alvin.
I have nothing to add to what Sandra just said, to be perfectly honest with you. The only thing that I would caution is we've also been involved with the Operation Denton, which is one of the other investigations in the Canova series, and we haven't seen the outcomes of that yet, so proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
Yeah, that's due this year, isn't it?
Yes.
Just a follow-up as well, because ICRA have said that they've got their own robust governance structures in place. In your opinion, how do these structures compare to those offered from Canova, particularly for the support around the family? Do you want to come in, Sandra? Because I think
I think it is early days. ICRA will say that they are using the processes of Canova. They're endorsing those processes, using them. I don't see it. I don't see it in relation to funneling families down into quite a narrow psychological framework in terms of what questions they have, and those questions are concentrated on, and families seem to be in that process for some time. And as I said earlier, I think I've been somewhat disappointed when I see people who have very particular life events that I would want to see fast-tracked through. But obviously, ICRA are developing their own model. Is it the right model? Time will tell. But certainly, I haven't seen the Canova-type process, which is very much around, families don't know what they don't know. And therefore, that process was very clear from the start, rather than trying to home people down into quite a narrow process.
Do anyone else want to add anything to that question?
Well, I think, look, the jury's out. I think it's very, very difficult to, in any way, fairly compare the outworking of Canova and that experience to an ICRA, which has only been established, in fairness. But certainly some of the building blocks and areas that we had of concern, we did raise those with ICRA, and there were changes made, so they have been prepared to be adaptive on the fringes. So we obviously have to wait and see.
And in relation to ICRA's governance, while yes, they have taken some criticisms on board and made some changes, I think the overall governance issue that I would have is that if they were talking about going along the lines of Canova, they've forgotten about the international perspective of it again. I'm sorry to keep harping back to that, but I do think it is important, because it's part of what will help build trust. It's part of what will possibly get people to engage in the process. And there's a long way to go to build that trust from the people that, and I don't want to say that I represent, but the people that the PFC works along with. And we're I'm not even sure with that internationalisation whether ICRA as it currently stands, in fact I know as it currently stands, it wouldn't get the buy-in from the people that work along with the Pat Finucane Centre, so there's much more needs to be done over a small tinkering around governance issues.
Can I just have one follow-up to Sandra, please? Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning of the process when you first started doing Canova that there was a huge lack of trust with the communities that were going through that process, but that turned around. Do you see any way of that happening? Can you foresee that happening with ICRA as it is?
I think it turned around because they saw very clearly that they could. That there was very clear in terms of what was promised to them was what was delivered to them. I think that they also saw the fact that it was a process that they were coming side by side with them, and that's something which was very important. I think the difficulty for ICRA is in terms of I think it's early life, and the legislation, and the fact that the legislation at the start was so flawed in that people are still watching and waiting. And I think that the other side of that was that the Operation Canova staff came very clearly with an outside view, and that I know that's difficult in many ways, but yet I think that's been essential. That actually was something which was very useful for families. Yes, you could say on one hand it's mistrustful because, well, what are you going to do? But on the other, in terms of seeing people that were genuinely committed to working with you, I think that's something which was important in relation to the Canova families, and particularly in relation to the circumstances of their loved one's death. Because I'm also conscious, Kenny, you made the point about in terms of representation from across the community in relation to ICRA. But I think for Canova there was a very, very clear and benefit in relation to having outside. And I think that's what's needed. It needs to have that level of scrutiny from outside.
We'll finish with Claire Hannah.
Thanks. I wanted to briefly ask about the independence of ICRA, and maybe you could outline how the appointments process affected confidence in the body, and how any new or reformed body could do that better. I don't know if anybody particularly wants to take that one, because nobody's making eye contact with me. I'm not sure.
And I'm going to caveat this by saying this is no reflection on any of the people who are employed within the ICRIR, but there isn't a perception of independence, and perception, unfortunately, in the north means an awful lot. And I don't know how we get around that, and I hear what Kenny says, that people shouldn't be excluded and whatever, but that is the perception, and to a certain degree, some of the families that we work along with would look at it as you're marking your own homework, and you can't get away from that. So any process that is going to be put in place needs to be seen to be independent, and unfortunately I can't give you the answer to how we do that.
Any suggestions, Sandra, in terms of, I don't know, conflict of interest policy, internationalisation, any ways that a reformed body could feel more independent? I mean, some of it, I suppose, comes to the upstream, is that the word I'm looking? The kind of the plumbing of it originally, I suppose, and how material is achieved and signed off. But is there anything to add to that around?
Well, other than I think that fundamentally I can see the benefit of having external personnel involved, and I think that goes without saying. I think over time you can see in terms of our history that we've needed that, and I think that the difficulty is that fundamentally that when people come in, they come in under legislation that in effect gave an amnesty, and that it took the courts to make those decisions, where I would have much preferred, as in Canova, that the framework was very clear from the very start. I think that it makes it very difficult when the framework's not clear from the start in relation to how it moves forward. and that causes difficulties. So what would need to happen? I said earlier, there would need to be a fundamental reshaping that probably wouldn't bear much resemblance to what is there. That there needs to be changes made that can ensure that people can trust the process, can go through the process, and can get the best from the process. And that's something which is really important. And I think that there is a challenge and of course a difficulty there.
Kenny?
I think the international dimension is something that people are growingly supportive of, and I think that could land. But in terms of for any grouping to be disbarred as of right from serving within that particular institution, I think you're going to see very, very big problems. So again, it's what is achievable, and if you want to bring people with you, you can certainly create an international dimension, but that cannot be at the expense of blocking an entire grouping of people from serving, because how that's read by a community is.
Do you think could there? And you're referring to people with an RUC background. Is there do you have any thoughts on a conflict of interest policy? Would you think that would need to be addressed up front in terms of people's perceptions of people who investigated or failed to investigate first time round, having a second dibs? Do you think that can be mitigated, and would a conflict of interest policy remove what people might see as an unfair barrier?
I think certainly clear that if there's the right approach taken, that it's about how do we gain maximum confidence. There are people who have a former RUC service background who can give a great deal to this process in a way that maybe others cannot. So whilst there is an added advantage sometimes in having an external input, there absolutely is a requirement also to have a localised input in all of this. It's whether or not people are motivated by ideological reasons, or whether this is about actually how we can attain the very best outcome for victim survivor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, Sandra and Kenny. Thank you very much for your time. Order.